Hello and welcome to the 13th edition of Exploring Enterprise, the podcast series from the Enterprise Research Centre. I'm Professor Stephen Roper, Director of the Enterprise Research Centre, and today we'll be discussing the mental health and well-being of entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Ute Stephan, Professor of Entrepreneurship at King's College London, Arosha Brouwer, who is co-founder and CEO at Quan, a digital wellbeing and team performance platform, and Jason Jaspal, Assistant Director of Business Development at the UK mental health charity Samaritans. Welcome, everybody. Ute, let's start with you, if we may. Your research expertise is very much in the psychology of entrepreneurship. And I gather you've just published a major analysis of the well-being of entrepreneurs covering around 80 countries, if I'm not wrong. What does some of the evidence tell us about the well-being of entrepreneurs globally?
Thank you very much, Stephen. And it's a pleasure to be here on this podcast to talk about this important topic, which I think we haven't actually talked about very much, entrepreneurs' mental health and well-being, even though there is a huge literature on employees' health and well-being. And that tells us just how important it is for productivity. And actually, from the little research we have on the consequences of entrepreneurs' mental health and well-being, we see that their mental well-being is even more important, if you want, for their own productivity, but also for the thriving of the business. So, there's evidence that happy entrepreneurs are more creative, more productive, the firms innovate more, they're more persistent, and ultimately also survive longer, the firms. So our question in that particular piece of research, where we really took stock of the evidence over 40 years, and we were guided by the question, essentially trying to answer, does being an entrepreneur make you happy? So is it a good career choice? Is it better to work for yourself or for somebody else? And what the evidence tells us, as you say, over 82 countries, over 7 million data points, on average, being an entrepreneur is good for your mental health and well-being. So you do find your life more satisfying. You certainly find your work more satisfying. What was interesting, considering that all the narrative around entrepreneurs and also the evidence tells us that they work the longest hours of anybody in the workforce and that they have a lot of stressors to deal with. So considering that, we were quite surprised to see that actually they don't report that they are more stressed. So that was intriguing. But I think there is really a paradox that if you're an entrepreneur and your work is very important to you, it almost becomes part of you because you built the business. Then it's really difficult to detach and actually recognize that you may be stressed when you're doing something you love. But there is newer evidence showing that physiologically, entrepreneurs tend to be more stressed. So it's both a good news and a bad news story, if you want. Yes, working for yourself makes you happier, but there might be also a bit of a negative effect in terms of physiologically, you're also more stressed, and that's something you have to pay attention to and manage, because if you manage the downside, then there's even more to be had in terms of a fulfilling and meaningful work life.
Ute, we've been through the worst, hopefully, of the COVID-19 pandemic over the last couple of years. And you've also been looking at the way that has influenced entrepreneurs over the last 18 months or so.
Yes, indeed. And so what we did was a big global study of entrepreneurs during COVID-19. So it was during the first wave of COVID. And we surveyed over 5,000 entrepreneurs in 25 countries. And just to give you a bit of context, these are not just any countries. They represent roughly half of the world's population and 3/4 of the world's GDP. And what we saw, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the worse COVID impacts your country, the worse the lockdowns were, the harder entrepreneurs' businesses were affected, and the more that actually depressed their own well-being. So stress levels went up and well-being went down. What's perhaps more interesting is, so what can you do about that? And we may remember all these stories, so entrepreneurs pivoting, and even some kind of saying, oh, entrepreneurs are best placed to deal with a shock like the pandemic because they're entrepreneurial, because they pivot, because they see opportunities, they know how to be flexible and get through a crisis. And so our research nuances that a bit. So yes, indeed, when the pandemic hit, entrepreneurs were trying to be flexible and adaptive, but that didn't necessarily support their well-being. It was only for those entrepreneurs who were flexible, adaptive, but also saw opportunities in the crisis, so new opportunities. That really then gave them a way out, so to speak, right? That kind of gives you back a sense of control, that you're not just adapting a plan, but you're actually knowing where you're going to go forward. And so the tricky bit is, in the middle of a crisis, how do you spot new opportunities when actually you're in crisis mode and just working all around the clock and don't really have any space, right? You're in that treadmill to kind of make sure the business survives. And so, we talk a bit about the importance of taking time out, kind of, I think, Stephen, you've done great research on innovation vouchers. So could we actually adopt something like that in terms of opportunity crisis vouchers to give entrepreneurs a bit of structure of how they can find new opportunities? And the business opportunities they identified, I mean, they were very broad and very spot on. So we saw the entrepreneurs in our study seeing opportunities that later on, by now we know, are important trends, from obviously anything to do with remote working, but also supporting well-being, like Arosha does with Quan, or Jason with the Samaritans, that that came much more to the forefront of opportunities, actually viable business opportunities, to things around sustainability and onshoring supply chains, and also kind of making sure to build locally and invest locally in communities more.
Thanks, Ute. And Jason, we'll come to you next, I think. I mean, Ute's talked about some of the challenges and maybe the opportunities that that COVID has presented. And I guess some of that will have been reflected in the experience of Samaritans over the last 18 months or 2 years. Have you seen an increase in the volume of work coming through from entrepreneurs or small business leaders to your organization over the last few months? What's that looked like?
Yeah, we have. I mean, Samaritans is a organisation best known for its helpline services and providing direct support to individuals. But as we've seen the role of the employer change and more businesses taking an interest in having a social purpose as well as having a profit, we've tried to set ourselves up for having more of a business-to-business offer. And over the last 3 years, we've really seen that grow on the whole. I think specifically around the small businesses and entrepreneurs, what we found are almost two groups kind of emerging. Quite stable organizations that are, small, maybe lifestyle businesses or individuals operating, freelance, etc. And they found, I guess, it quite an overwhelming experience in terms of all of the resources that are available and trying to navigate what role they should be playing in this area. And I think we found a lot of them coming towards us because of our brand positioning in our history, and the fact that we have an evidence base for some of the things that we subscribe to. And I think there's a lot out there. And I think if you're a small business owner or leader and you're thinking about your environmental responsibility, your responsibility towards perhaps a small workforce, your responsibility towards your stakeholders, your customers, as well as your brand, and there are all these different, sometimes forces pulling you in different directions. And we found a lot of feedback from individuals not quite knowing how to navigate that. And then there's a second group that we've really noticed in terms of almost more of the startups, organizations that are accelerating very quickly. So they're small, but maybe they're getting bigger. And they're finding they need to be almost future-proofing themselves around some of this stuff in terms of, in order to compete for talent and in order to be really, really clear around what their long-term strategy is going to be around well-being. I guess the other nuance to all of this is that we found organizations that are really thinking about what they need to do for their own workforce or for individuals working on their own, sole trade, people working for themselves, for themselves, but also some that are quite exposed to vulnerable people, vulnerable customers, vulnerable people externally, and kind of what's their responsibility to them, what part are they playing in that almost well-being or mental health supply chain. And that's a slightly different dynamic. So all of that, I think, is what we found. And it's meant that we've even in order to, I guess, be clear about the fact we are in this space, we've almost set up a sub-brand for this business to business kind of market to try to help organizations, find their way through.
I think that's fascinating, Jason, and it's a testament to the Samaritans organization about that responsiveness, I think, which is great to hear about. I want to come back to the question about whether there are different impacts on male and female entrepreneurs and perhaps whether they react differently. And so Ute and Jason, I'll come back to you on that one in a minute. So I'll give you a bit of thinking time. But Arosha, you've heard Ute talk a little bit from the research perspective and Jason from the sort of practical intervention side. I guess there's lots here that resonates perhaps with you as a female entrepreneur.
Absolutely. And the company that I'm responsible for sits in that second camp of what Jason just described. So we're a startup budding into scale up. Lots of knowledge workers, exceptionally bright, smart, and indeed there's a war for talent. When you're building an organization which is growing at such a pace, there's a lot of stresses and demands that are put on not just the founders but the entire team. But I totally agree to what Ute mentioned in terms of the entrepreneurs, the founders in this case. It's our idea that we're pushing out into the market. We're creating something out of it, and the entity requires so much of us just to get it to that next phase. And it's just pure energy and drive, which gets it through that initial phase. And then you hire your founding team, and they believe in the cause just as much. And then it takes their energy, right? And so, and the primary reason why Quan exists is because we recognize that so many companies are very good at measuring what they achieve, but not so good at measuring how they achieve it. And so the reason why Quan ceases to exist is because we want to place well-being at the heart of success. We want well-being to be measured and managed as a strategic priority. And so for us, being the company that we are, we do measure and manage it. And I am acutely aware of my own well-being, and so is Lucy, my co-founder, and we do take self-awareness very, very seriously, and do practice what we preach.
So, Arosha, tell us a little bit more about Quan itself and where the idea came from. What was the kind of research? What was the thinking that kind of led you to go down this direction and establish the company?
Absolutely. Well, it really literally starts with a dream that I had 2.5 years ago at the onset of COVID, when I suddenly woke up one morning. I had been an independent consultant for a long period of time, and basically woke up one morning 10 days into COVID and thought to myself, what is well-being? And realized I didn't have an answer to it, and recognized that well-being was becoming more and more an important topic. All sorts of things were happening in the world. Everybody, I felt, was organizing a webinar about mental health. And there were fruit boxes flying left, right, and center as organizations were trying to get a handle of no one's in the office anymore, but we need to help them. And I was like, well, before we start offering everyone different pieces of advice, maybe we should know what it is. And so myself and a few founding teams, members of Quan, started looking into the topic of well-being, and we were surprised to learn that it's a 100-year science with more than 200 predictors. And so, of course, nobody can answer the question because it's very, very complicated. And so the original hypothesis of Quan was, if we increase self-awareness and point people to self-care, the situation should improve. But 2 years on, and having worked with, we did user research with more than 1,000 people, and now we're working with more than 25 companies. But what we found was, School of Clinical Psychology will say, increase self-awareness, point to self-care, the situation improves. But the School of Organizational Psychology will say context matters. And in a world where there's thousands of well-being applications, Quan is more about context. So in a very simple way, what we do is basically two things. One, is we've developed a very holistic assessment of well-being, which covers beyond mental health or physical, sense of meaning, social connectedness, self-fulfillment. Underneath that, we have 28 sub-dimensions beneath that, 200 predictors. But within 8 minutes, an individual becomes more acutely aware of the topics that they need to address. And when you aggregate that, a team becomes more aware of the topics that is impacting the group. But measuring is only one part. So the second part of Quan is that we teach teams basically to do one thing very, very well. And that's a 2-hour meeting every quarter where you go from the data to a structured discussion. And then we match the team with proven rituals that are peer-reviewed, but also science-backed. And basically teams do that every quarter. So at an organizational and team level, you're measuring a well-being index, but at a team level, you're also having the discussion and adopting healthier ways of working. And that's Quan.
So I suppose, Jason, there's going to be quite some commonality between the way that Quan is approaching this and the way also the Samaritans offer to businesses potentially. I mean, context is an important element of this, clearly, whether it's just the business is succeeding or failing or how that's working. And then self-awareness and I guess self-care is very much something that's in the Samaritans tradition through the volunteering aspect of this, but also very much part of that sort of organizational DNA, isn't it?
It is. I mean, most of our, in fact, all of our interventions and business services are based on the fundamentals of our listening service, which is human connection, peer support, active listening, and talk therapies. So we are that's the core, our core principles, and we're very confident around the evidence base, and we've got some good. There's been lots of research around that, which I'm sure colleagues on the call will have seen as well. I think as Arosha, I think the bit about context is really interesting, because where we're seeing a generation growing up that don't necessarily have the same expectations around human connection that perhaps generations past have had, then we do need to, we have begun leaning more into the self-help kind of space, and how we can develop applications, exercises, rituals, as Arosha said. But that's newer ground for us, but we can see there's definitely a need for it. We know that mental health for younger people is a very different landscape to what it might have been for people of my age. And I think that probably ties in quite well with when we think about the entrepreneur profile, the young, some of the younger people that might be setting up organizations. They're coming into it with different expectations, different skills, a much higher expectation of things being available immediately at the touch of a digital button, rather than getting on the phone and calling a traditional service.
Thanks, Jason. That's really interesting. And I think the sort of demographic differences that you've highlighted are very evident in a lot of the work that we've done in ERC as well, in terms of the sort of way in which older and younger entrepreneurs, or there might be gender differences in the way that people actually deal with good or poor well-being. Ute, I don't know whether there's any evidence from the transnational study or from the COVID piece around the sort of gender or age differences of the way that different groups of entrepreneurs might deal with these things, or cope better or worse with these kind of risk factors.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. There are quite strong gender differences, and some of them go in the direction you would expect, right? COVID, home working disadvantages women because traditionally they still share more of the housework and the care work. And the policy implication for that one is relatively straightforward. If we think of the UK, we have one of the OECD countries where it's most expensive to have childcare. So if you make childcare less expensive, then you allow women to engage more. But I think there's a wider issue, which is really interesting. If we think about entrepreneurship, kind of traditionally, it's quite a stereotypically male career, and actually a white male career, for better or worse. If you look at the prototypes we often discuss, if we make well-being part of the definition of success and of entrepreneurship, then we also open entrepreneurship up to a whole other part of the population that typically don't think about themselves as entrepreneurs. But if they can see entrepreneurship as a way to self-fulfillment, as something where, you know, they can be themselves, because ultimately as an entrepreneur, you can shape your own work around your skills, around your preferences, around your values. So it's where you can really make an impact. Then, you know, we not just get more diverse entrepreneurship, which is good for the individuals involved, because the bottom line is if you manage the stress, it is a very meaningful, self-actualizing career. But you also get the benefit for the economy, because you all of a sudden have, you know, there's reports that talk about the 2 million missing entrepreneurs. And if you were to engage them, and many of them are women, you know, if we were to engage them, we would increase economic output dramatically.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, we've got the very high level evidence around, you know, women are much more likely to seek help versus men. And that's a very, very high level generalization. I guess what we found in terms of actual small businesses is that the sector that you operate in has a big bearing on what the experience of being a leader or being a part of that organization was like. It's not necessarily it's not necessarily a cause, but it's there's definitely some correlation, and I think the correlation probably comes down to other factors of inequality around social class, socioeconomic background, wage. So if I use the example of the construction sector is made up of, you know, 80% of the construction sector is businesses of less than 10 people in the UK. It's the supply chain. And the well-being crisis that exists in that sector is very well known. The suicide rate is 4 times that of the average person. So the research tells us it's because it's predominantly men. It's that sector has a reading age of 12. It has a mean salary which is very, very low. Work is seasonal. Work is not particularly well structured in terms of or reliable in terms of 0 hours contracts and the rest of it. So I think when you take it back, it often comes back to the same challenges around inequality and having space to explore this and the entry point of individuals operating in those markets.
I think that's very true, Jason. And we're in ERC, we're involved in a centre which focuses on sort of rural businesses. And there, you know, a lot of those are agribusinesses, and we've seen particular issues, I think, with mental health in some rural communities, which are often not very closely observed. Arosha, I wanted just to come to you, and then I'll come back to Ute. One of the issues that we've seen in the data that we've collected, and it's been information from sort of large groups of companies in the Midlands, has been firms reluctant to sort of take on board mental health promotion and these kinds of practices. And when we've looked at that, that's been a relatively small proportion of enterprises. How do you get over the barrier with Quan of actually persuading employers that this is something that they really should do?
It's a very good question. There's a couple of things to that. Firstly, I think the jury's out on the topic of mental health and the importance of that, because, you know, it feels like over the last 2 years, so much attention is on the topic of mental health. I mean, you know, the World Health Organization is just one leading organization that's published a lot. Also, when you look at the statistics, it's pretty dreary out there. Not just the statistics when it comes to actual burnout across the globe, but also the great attrition. So 1 in 3 workers are looking for a new job, at least in the US and here in the Netherlands as well. It's not a question of whether leaders see this as an important topic. In fact, they do, and there's much more spend going towards mental health. My argument would be that companies are willing to spend on it, but it's not a strategic priority. And that's the issue, right? So they're happy to invest in an app to give support for the employees. But what about looking at work design so that the actual core ways of working are changed so that maybe workload is less? And that is something which we really need to pay attention to. So employers will spend money on it, and they will buy applications, and most times the adoption of those therapy apps or meditation apps are about 10 to 20%. But is it actually being measured and managed in a way that it is seen as a strategic priority next to your financial KPI? Only the very forward-thinking organizations. So that is what we would like to see change over time.
I think that charms very well with some of the evidence I've seen on some of the US studies where employers have tried to do these things, but it's really the people that don't necessarily need the intervention that very often take it up, and those people who do need the intervention are perhaps a bit more reluctant to take up fitness programs or whatever else it is. Ute, is there a business case for this for these kinds of interventions? What does the evidence suggest around that?
So I'm going to be very atypical for an academic and just say, yes, there is a business case for that. It doesn't depend on anything. As Arosha said in the beginning, we have 100 years of research on well-being in the workplace and beyond the workplace. And what we do know for the workplace, for employees, is, yes, well-being matters. You get not just more productive employees and more creative employees, you also avoid the downside. We haven't really talked about the downside of stress so much, but one of the things that stress does is it makes you cut corners, because literally you feel overwhelmed. You don't know how to get through any longer. But that's really bad for the organization, because these cutting corners are also some ethical corners. So, there is a downside that's quite significant, and then there is an upside that's quite significant. So there is clearly a business case for looking after employee mental health and well-being. I would absolutely second what both Jason and Arosha said, right? There is a lot you can do for the individual outside of work, and that's important, and I don't want to diminish that. But I think when it comes to the workplace, how you treat employees in terms of how much decision-making freedom they have in their work. Are they just being told to execute? Do they actually have a voice? Can they actually make suggestions of how to do things better? Do you actually listen to those suggestions? Do you actually feedback what you do with them? Do you keep an eye on employees really taking their annual leave entitlements? Do you keep an eye on how long they work? We know that longer working hours are not productive. There is a U-shaped curve. So actually you're better to communicate very clearly, working time limits are there for a reason, not just because we have the evidence that you're going to die earlier if you constantly work longer hours, but also because you're more productive if you keep the hours constrained. When we go to the entrepreneurs, the evidence is not quite as large and substantive, partly because we've only started really at paying attention to entrepreneurs' mental health and well-being 10, 15 years ago. But all the evidence we have there is also, there is a business case. And it's particularly tricky, I think, to convey that. So going back to the point that only people who are already gone through a burnout, who are sensitized to mental health issues, are taking that up. And that's a pattern we really see in the entrepreneurial world, that anybody who's gone through a burnout is advocating, sometimes creating companies around entrepreneurs' mental health and well-being. And that's really important. But I wish entrepreneurs didn't have to go through that rock bottom to then arrive at the conclusion that, maybe paying attention to stress and mental health is important. So if you're an entrepreneur and you do things like work longer hours, feel guilty when you're not working, you're feeling that you're the best person to do everything in your company, that you don't delegate necessarily, you don't take breaks, you don't say no, you take on more than you can stomach, you spend less time with your family, ever less time with friends, you don't have any hobbies any longer. These are the early warning signs for burnout. And so that's time when actually you need to work less to be able to work more productively for longer. So in the short term, it's really important to pay attention to the little things. So how you organize your work, can you actually, and I know it's really hard when you build a company that you trust somebody else and delegate work, they won't be able to do it as well as you. But maybe 80% is okay if that gives you 2 hours more sleep in the night, because you can't compromise on your body. Your body doesn't forgive you in the long term. So, pay attention to getting enough sleep regularly, find out how much sleep you need, because we're all a bit different. It's not magic. To try and implement a regime of taking little breaks throughout the day. It's really how you design your work, taking little breaks throughout the day, like 5 minutes every hour. Again, doesn't sound magic. What it does is it's proven to make you more productive, because once you train yourself to that rhythm, you work towards this end of 55 minutes. And these 5 minutes away are really important for taking a break, not thinking about work. And you'll be amazed once you do this a few days, how much more creative you are when you restart work. And there's other little things, but basically what I'm trying to convey is it's not something that you have to add to your to-do list as an entrepreneur. It's just little changes that can actually make a really big difference in how you organize your work, and that it's top of mind, for instance, that you cannot compromise on your sleep.
I was talking to an entrepreneur last week, and they were saying that they'd had 1 week off over the last 2 years, and they're trying to grow their business, and they're well and enjoying it. But I did wonder whether that was a sensible personal development strategy or family development strategy, shall we say? So some of your advice may be very useful there. We're clearly living in very challenging times. Well, I mean, we've come off the end of the COVID thing. At least in the UK now, we're entering this cost of doing business crisis. And I'd just like to finish just perhaps with 1 or 2 ideas around what we should be doing to help entrepreneurs sustain their mental health and well-being. And Ute, you've given us a really good start with that. So Jason, are there 1 or 2 things that would be your top tips really for sort of sustaining well-being, good mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to what we said earlier, I think context is important. It doesn't look the same for every individual. So recognizing oneself and what support works well for you, whether that is the extra hour of sleep, whether that's doing a bit of exercise, what are the things that help you manage ultimately, and hardwiring those things that work for you into your day. And then I think the other thing for me is going back to what Samaritans stands for. It's about ensuring you don't become isolated, and whether that connection is having it, sending an email to a friend, or a text message, or a phone call, or going for a cup of coffee with somebody. I think it's making sure you don't become isolated.
Thanks, Jason. Arosha, what's your tuppence worth on the top tips?
I'd like to echo both Ute and Jason's comments. As an entrepreneur, firstly, you think by spending 24 hours on your business, you move ahead. And, this is partly because of just incorrect information coming out of, ill-informed entrepreneurs, to be honest, that if you work more than everybody else, then your company grows. It's not true. Just making it a priority for yourself. And as Jason says, knowing your own triggers. We all have them. And, I'm called Ratty Roche at work if I start to demonstrate it. And I've told everyone about them. So they hold me accountable. So I know when I'm getting into a state, basically, inform your loved ones, inform your team. It is a hard road, but it gets all that much harder if you put too much pressure on yourself. So for me, it would just be knowing your triggers, making it a priority, and getting the support of the people around you. So really building on what Jason and Ute have already said.
Thanks, Arosha. Ute, a final quick comment, or does it come back to the sort of self-awareness and the that sort of looking after yourself that you were talking about before, and the breaks and time management and all the rest of those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think everything that was said, it's very individual. I mean, there's no kind of one quick fix. It's also not a quick fix. So it's something, little changes every day lead to really big downstream effects. And overall, I just wish if we all talked a little bit more about health and well-being, just how important it is, not just nice to have, that it is a key business priority. It should be, especially not just for the entrepreneurs and their own productivity, but also, think about attracting talent. We have a very tight labor market, and we know that people need money, that's true, but from a certain level onward, you also want a bit more out of work than just covering your bills. When times are most challenging and you feel least able to take a break and look after yourself, that's when you most certainly need to take a break and look after yourself and pick up the phone and talk to a friend you haven't talked for a long time.
Ute, thank you very much. Arosha, thank you. Jason, thank you very much. We're past our time for today, but that has been fascinating. I think we could have continued this conversation for about another 3 hours and still had plenty more to say. And that's a testament to all of you and the great insight that you've shared. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to those of you listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you want to find out more about the support offered by Samaritans, please visit their website at www.samaritans.org. If you want to find out more about the work of the Enterprise Research Centre, you can find that at www.enterpriseresearch.ac.uk. And you will also find there links to all of the work that Ute has been talking about, a link back to the Samaritans, and we'll also put a link to the Quan platform. So if you're interested in following that up, you can find that there. Thank you very much, everyone. And I think with that, we'll call it a day. Thank you.